welcome everyone to the Asia Law Weekly Talk at the U.S. Asia Law Institute, the Law School of NYU. I am Catherine Wilhelm, Executive Director of the Institute. And today's talk is part of our regular weekly speaker series, which we are holding each Wednesday this spring term. Our exact starting time, as you may be noticing, does shift a bit from week to week. So that depends on where in the world our speakers are sitting. So you'll have to watch the webpage, watch our Twitter feed for the exact time. A week from today, our speaker is going to be Professor Petros Mavroidis from Columbia Law School, who will be talking about China and the WTO. But today's topic is U.S.-Asia relations in the Biden administration. And I should say at the outset, this topic is very ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. It's so big that we had to invite two speakers to try to tackle it. And even then, for reasons of time, we are obviously not going to be able to talk about U.S. relations with all of the important countries in Asia. So I apologize in advance about that. Our speakers are experts in international law and international institutions. And so our focus to some extent is going to be on those aspects of the U.S.-Asian relationship, and in particular on U.S. relations with ASEAN, which is the region's most important grouping, and with China. So first, for the U.S.-ASEAN part of the conversation, we are going to hear from Professor Nilufer Oral, who is director of the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, and also a member of the United Nations International Law Commission. And she has many other affiliations and accomplishments, but I don't want to take from her time to go into that. Please see her biography on our website. Her center has a team that focuses on researching and teaching ASEAN law and policy. And then after that, for the US-China part, we will be hearing from Professor José Alvarez, who is a law professor at NYU, focusing on international law, foreign investment, and international organizations. And he is also the faculty director for the U.S. Asia Law Institute. So they will lay out their analyses of the challenges that Biden's team faces in Asia and what they expect to happen. We welcome your questions as always. And so please feel free to start typing questions into the Q&A panel at any point. No need to wait for a particular portion of the program. And then after the speakers make their opening remarks, we'll begin discussing, and I will start drawing questions from that panel. So with that, I'd like to invite Professor Oral to lead us off with your thoughts on the challenges the Biden administration faces in dealing with ASEAN.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine. And greetings to everyone from Singapore. It's really a great honor and delight to be part of this series on a very topical and important issue. So what I'm going to do is just outline a little bit from the ASEAN perspective and lay out a little bit of the situation. So if I could first start with a little bit about ASEAN, as not everyone in the audience may be familiar with it. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It was formed originally by 5 of the states, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Philippines in 1967. And this is right at the height of the Cold War between the US and the former USSR. And also we should recall during a period of the escalation of the US-Vietnam War. Now, going back to that time, China was a different China. It was undergoing its cultural revolution under Chairman Mao. Overall, ASEAN as a region was poor and rather unstable. Now it's changed. And just as an example, Singapore, which in 1967 had a GDP per capita around US $500, today it's more than $65,000 per capita, although ASEAN, not all economies are equal, and I have to bear that in mind. Now let's fast forward into the 21st century. ASEAN grew from 5 to 10 states with the addition of Brunei, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Overall, it has a total population over 650 million people, which is bigger than the EU. And for the most part, the economies of the ASEAN states have been expanding. Now, ASEAN's governing instrument is the ASEAN Charter, very important. It was adopted in 2007. And I'm just going to give you some of the principles because this is key to understanding the ASEAN governance system. Mutual respect for the independence, sovereignty, equality, territorial integrity, national identity of all nations, the right of every state to lead its national existence free from external interference, subversion, or coercion, and non-interference in the internal affairs of one another. And the last point is particularly important. Also, I should stress what is considered to be the ASEAN way. It operates purely by consensus, seeks unity among its members, non-confrontational, and is based on mutual respect. Now, when it comes to foreign relations, and specifically in respect to the great powers, which was U.S., United States, and China, for them it has been the policy of equidistant diplomacy, friends with both. And this is very important for understanding the situation that the ASEAN nation, or ASEAN is today. So in other words, with each they'll have friendly relations. This clearly has been challenged during the Trump administration, which adopted a very confrontational attitude towards China on trade, regional security, and even the pandemic, which we'll be talking about later. I want to give a little bit of a context to the US, China, and ASEAN relations. And a bit of a comparison. So the US has been engaged with ASEAN since 1977. In 1996, China became a full dialogue partner. This is another group of relations with ASEAN. But although China might have started a bit later engaging with ASEAN, it has been very active. First of all, it was the first of the non-ASEAN countries to become a party in 2003 to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia. The US did not become a party until 2009. Now, President Obama in 2011 named the first resident ambassador to ASEAN, I think as part of his pivot to Asia policy, but China had already done this in 2008. In 2015, the United States and ASEAN elevated the relationship to a strategic partnership, but China had already done this in 2003. So during the Obama administration, the US had upgraded its relationship with ASEAN as part of Obama's pivot to Asia, but I think China had been engaged with ASEAN much more actively prior. Now, importantly, during the Obama administration, part of this upgrading is sent high-level US representatives to the ASEAN summits. However, this changed under the Trump administration. While former President Trump attended the first ASEAN summit, he skipped the rest. And indeed, he sent a very low-level representative to the summit that was held in Thailand in 2017. And these actions were viewed as being somewhat disrespectful to ASEAN, and particularly worrisome as the tensions between China and the US were escalating, placing ASEAN in a very difficult situation because the last thing ASEAN wants to do is to have to take sides. For a long time, they've enjoyed good relations with both, and to take sides would create problems, including the potential of creating division within ASEAN, because individually the states have different relationships with China and the United States. China has been engaging with ASEAN, as I said. In fact, it was the relationship kind of known as the Charm Offensive, particularly started in the 2000s. And now we can see with the pandemic, China's engaging again with this vaccine diplomacy. Just today it was on the news. And we know, unfortunately, US and Europe are scrambling to find supplies. During this period, before and right after the election of President Biden, China has been actively visiting, ramping up its visits to ASEAN countries. In January, the foreign minister Wang Yi visited Myanmar, Indonesia, Brunei, and the Philippines, and just in fall, did another round of visits to ASEAN countries, including Singapore. And during this time, the language of ASEAN of China has been advocating multilateralism, let's advance free trade, and safeguarding regional stability. I want to speak a little bit about trade. Over the years, the ASEAN region has developed economically and is now the third largest economy in the Indo-Pacific region and the fifth largest in the world. And without doubt, it has benefited greatly from the tremendous growth and expansion of China's trade and China's economy, and of course, from what has been a relatively stable relationship in the region and with the big powers. It's been mostly in that way. ASEAN is now a critical hub for global trade. Some $3.4 trillion in global trade transits through the ASEAN region each year. And remember, the Malacca Straits are a very important choke point for international trade. The United States is ASEAN's fourth largest trading partner. And now I guess there's an export between the US and ASEAN of over $105 billion. However, China holds a very strong trade position with ASEAN. ASEAN is now China's #1 trading partner. China has been ASEAN's top trading partner for 11 consecutive years, and these trade relations have increased significantly. They've been in trade relations negotiations since 2002 and signed, which culminated in the ASEAN-China Free Trade Area Agreement, which was later upgraded with a protocol. And since President Biden was elected, China's already signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, an important regional agreement that includes all 10 member ASEAN states. And as we recall, President Trump actually withdrew from another very important regional trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and I think Professor Alvarez will talk more about these trade relations. So without doubt, the trade war between the US and China was extremely worrisome situation for the ASEAN member states who, as I say, do not want to take sides. This is very central to their policy. And the worst case scenario is to have to choose between these two great economic powers for the ASEAN states. But so the hope is that this will change with the Biden administration. And of course, it is telling that President Biden has appointed as the new deputy assistant to the president and created a new position as coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs, Kirk Campbell, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs under then President Barack Obama. He is known as the architect of President Obama's pivot to Asia policy. Now I'm going to talk about the third issue. It's complex, and that is basically the South China Sea. Because it's complex, I could go into great depth, but basically, among the ASEAN states, the South China Sea, certain members have overlapping maritime, territorial, and sovereignty claims in a region that China has drawn this famous 9-dash line. This dispute has been around for decades, actually. And it has evolved, resource disputes, fisheries in particular. But it all escalated when China embarked upon island construction on the Spratlys and on reefs and atolls, creating artificial islands, sending in naval vessels, militarization. And this started in 2012. In 2013, the Philippines brought an international arbitration case under the law of the Sea Convention against China. And in 2016, the tribunal basically decided the case in favor of the Philippines. Now, China rejected jurisdiction of the tribunal, did not appear directly, and has not accepted and vehemently objects to the judgment itself. But this has been a source of tension, of course. Now, before Trump, the US policy basically for that region was, stability, peaceful relations, and importantly, it has to do with freedom of navigation, overflight, and operation. There was no direct confrontational position, except towards the end of his administration, Obama did send a diplomatic note to China concerning the South China Sea maritime claims. The difference is that when President Trump became much more amplified this position and became much more directly confrontational, it's interesting because in the 2017 APEC meeting, apparently President Trump even offered to personally mediate the dispute. It's Foreign Minister Pompeo who has really escalated to direct attacks to China on the South China Sea through ASEAN. So, for example, during in 2020, a virtual meeting of ASEAN, Secretary of State Pompeo attacked China, and he told the ASEAN member states, keep going, don't just speak up, but act. Reconsider business deals with companies that bully ASEAN states in the South China Sea. So this is a very, a direct and confrontational approach. And also referred to, the Chinese Communist Party to not walk over the ASEAN states. So in some circles, this was seen as Trump-Pompeo administration using the South China conflict to drive a wedge between ASEAN and China relations. In fact, it has elevated it not to the South China dispute to a regional dispute, to one where now is it between directly the U.S. and China and the ASEAN states to some degree, I should say, being put in a position of, I don't want to say being used, but in a difficult situation. So where in the past it was basically for the U.S. was preservation of freedom of navigation, this has changed. This did change in the Trump administration. So the question is, so ASEAN has a very different way for addressing disputes. And for example, they've been working on a code of conduct specifically on the South China Sea with China. In fact, this started in the 90s. But since 2002 in a code of conduct, it started off as a declaration of conduct, guidelines, and now they're working on a conduct that should be coming to some conclusion, but the pandemic has created a little bit of a gap there. So what will the President Biden's position be? Well, already we know that he sent aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt to exercise the freedom of navigation claims in the South China Sea. Apparently the U.S. Coast Guard is also maybe going into this region. China, on the other hand, has also upped the situation by a new law that authorizes Coast Guard to use force in areas of national sovereignty, and this probably includes the South China Seas. So the Southeast Asia is becoming a centrifugal force for big powers muscle flexing, which has immediate impact for ASEAN and certainly places tremendous stress on its policy of equidistance diplomacy. That means being friends with both China and the US. So I've now come to my concluding comments. I hope I haven't gone too long. So in my concluding comments, I just want to refer to a very recent op-ed in the Singapore Straits Times by someone who is truly an ASEAN China-US relations expert, and that is Singapore's Ambassador at Large, Professor Tommy Koh. And these are the 4 points he made concerning the Biden administration steps towards ASEAN. First, that President Biden should hold an annual summit with the leaders of ASEAN. Second, that President Biden or Vice President Kamala Harris should attend the annual ASEAN summit and related summits. In Asia, relationships matter, and turning up is a show of respect, alluding, of course, to Trump's failure to appear. Third, that the Biden administration should respect ASEAN's aspiration to maintain its unity, centrality, and independence, because ASEAN does not wish to be pressured by the great powers to take sides. And fourth, that Biden administration should seriously consider rejoining the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I will end my comments there, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nilufer. That was very comprehensively setting out the table for us of the main issues that that exist in that small part of Asia. And this, of course, again, makes obvious what I said at the top, that by focusing on just part of Asia, we aren't by any means really narrowing down our topics of discussion or the challenges that we want to probe that much. There's still extremely diverse and challenging. So now I'm going to go directly to José Alvarez for you to make your opening remarks, and then afterwards we'll come back and we'll all start to raise some of the questions that I already see in the Q&A panel.
Great. Well, thank you, Catherine. And I'm very grateful for Professor Oral for presenting what she did, and also to end up with Tommy Koh's important editorial in the Straits Times, which I do urge people to look at. And from my perspective, where I will focus on China, what is striking about his deep analysis, all of which I agree with respect to the areas where you're likely to see continuity from Trump to Biden, where you're going to see change from Trump to Biden with respect to how Biden will deal with ASEAN and Southeast Asia, and with Japan, Australia, and India, North Korea. All of those analysis, at least from my perspective, given what my topic is, really go through China. That is, almost everything that Ambassador Koh points to can be explained from at least the U.S. perspective in terms of predictions about responses to the rise of China. And what Ambassador Koh points out is an important warning that it's far too easy and likely for the Biden administration to see everything through the U.S.-China relationship and not to consider the individual needs, aspirations, and the respect that needs to be accorded to those individual Asian nations, many of which have complex relationships with China and are not about to just readily take sides as if this really was a new Cold War. The other papers that I asked Catherine Wilhelm to put up are important ones that, even if I don't get to totally talk about in my remarks, are good framework papers for thinking about U.S.-China relations. One is a foreign affairs piece published in September, October from 2019. And what is important about it is that it is co-authored by Kurt Campbell, who, as was just mentioned, is now the new coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs, and Jake Sullivan, the nominee for National Security Advisor. These are two very important individuals with respect to U.S.-China relationships, and importantly, in that piece takes a nuanced position, I would say, with respect to the future of U.S.-China relations, that basically says, look, the old notion of decoupling completely the two states and descending into the equivalent of a cold, which could easily slide into a hot war, that's now not our policy. That will not be the policy of the Biden administration. At the same time, don't expect a full reset to a time, to the early days of Obama or before, when everybody was expecting China to completely modify its behavior and to adapt to a liberal international order set by the United States, and the ground rules being a liberal economic state ruled by the WTO under rather traditional rules of a liberal market, the Washington Consensus model for development, and that China would accept the status quo and be effectively a rule taker and not a rule maker, despite its rapidly growing economic and military power. So Campbell and Sullivan's posture, revealingly entitled Competition Without Catastrophe, is basically taking this middle stance that no, we can't expect a full reset where we're going to expect China to adapt to us, but no, we don't want to descend into a Cold War. And so that is reminiscent, I think, of what is described in Tommy Koh's short op-ed as a cold peace. That is, the attempt will be by the Biden administration to not descend into war, but not also have full set relationships as if nothing has changed with the rise of China. Contrast that approach to a piece that is quite controversial. It's also linked here on the website if you want to see it, at least linked on the chat box, sorry, published in the Atlantic Council anonymously by supposedly a government official. We don't know who, whether it's a relationship to Trump's administration or the new Biden one. And it's called the Longer Telegram. And it alludes to an old piece that set up the strategy for the Cold War between the United States and then the Soviet Union. In my analysis, I don't agree with the presumptions of how to see China. But what is striking about the piece is that it takes a very hard line, very much closer to the line that the former Secretary of State Pompeo took. And it is a piece that is there for the possibility that it could be that we end up in a much harder posture with respect to Biden than is stated in the Kurt Campbell Sullivan piece. The other reason why I think that piece is useful, at least for my purposes here, is that even if you don't agree with the analysis it gives of Chinese politics and the future of the Communist Party and much else, what it does do is provide a handy list of areas where you're likely to see red lines between the two states, where if one of them crosses them, we could actually be in a real war with real use of force, versus lines where there's strategic competition and perhaps some room for even economic sanctions being imposed between the two states, if not outright war, to areas of strategic competition where you're likely to see hard efforts between the two to compete, for example, with the hearts and minds of lesser developed states, to areas where there could actually be lots of cooperation, joint efforts to achieve global goods. And I think the lists in the Atlantic Council report are useful that way because they happen to be very consistent. Those lists of issues and the categories and the pockets of putting them, the buckets in which you put them, with pieces that are diametrically opposed in terms of the domestic analysis of Chinese politics. So even folks that radically disagree on whether we should be threatened by the rise of China or whether we should decouple altogether, as the Trump administration wanted, and those who want to have a much more cooperative relationship, as if China was no different than any other state in the world, they still agree on the sort of lists and where the buckets occur, even if they don't agree on exactly what the U.S. stance should be with respect to the overall relationship. So in my broader paper that was linked to this talk, I suggest that one of the long-term changes that is likely to outlast the Trump administration is a far more hostile view towards China. I still agree with that. I think that the appointment of Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and others affirm my initial speculations about predicting what that is. And as if you read that piece, I basically say that Biden will take the posture that echoes a Mao expression of walking on two legs. That is, he will sometimes cooperate with China, sometimes compete with China, and sometimes be quite antagonistic towards China, depending on the point of view of whether the stance will advance particular U.S. goals. This is the expression, walk on two legs. And that means that it will be from Monday to Tuesday, the U.S. could be imposing sanctions on China, accusing it of genocide. But on the rest of the week, it could be cooperating on climate change, on trying to prevent North Korea from sending missiles, on a variety of technical issues, including bilateral agreements to cooperate on space or other areas of global common concerns. And that includes deep possibilities of cooperation, not just with respect to climate change, but to help assist the UN to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. But what I do want to at least draw from the Atlantic Council report are what are some of those issues in the buckets. So in terms of the red lines, where you're likely to see a Biden administration say, if you disrupt the status quo with respect to these issues, you can expect extreme reactions from the US, including possibly the threat of use of force. And that would include a Chinese military attack against Taiwan or its offshore islands, including an economic blockade or a major cyber attack against Taiwanese public infrastructure and institutions. Any Chinese attack against Japanese forces in the defense of what the US considers and Japan considers sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands for Japan and the surrounding exclusive economic zone in the East China Sea, and already Biden and Prime Minister of Japan have talked about the U.S. defense guarantee for the Senkaku Islands. So that seems to be a red line as well. And there is, and I think you just heard, the possibility of a U.S. Adverse reaction to certain Chinese hostile actions in the South China Sea, and that could include further efforts to reclaim and militarize certain islands, to deploy force against claimant states in that region, or to prevent full freedom of navigation operations by the United States and allied maritime forces. Those are the red lines. And then there are the not so red lines, but still capable of eliciting military sanctions, for example, by the Biden administration. And that includes refusal by China within a reasonable time frame to cooperate on the nuclear arms reduction. Any action, of course, that threatens the security of the U.S. space assets or global communications system. Of course, any major Chinese cyber attack against U.S. or allied governments' critical economic, social, or political infrastructure, and the one that's clearly on the table right now, acts of genocide, where I think it's likely that, at least given Anthony Blinken's statements, he's going to agree with the very last minute Trump administration declaration that Chinese actions in Shandong province, its internment camps, its efforts to sterilize women, for instance, are acts of genocide. And although the U.S. has still not officially endorsed that position, and the UN, the Biden administration's UN ambassador, has not yet affirmed that agreement with Anthony Blinken, it is likely, in my view, that the Biden administration will take the lead on declaring this an act of genocide. And those who follow international law know that the Genocide Convention anticipates that that's not a routine declaration. That is, you're expected to do something. Now, it's not necessarily military action, but at a minimum, I would think that the U.S. would help to lead efforts to get international scrutiny by UN bodies into what's going on inside China with respect to these acts. And I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. tries to propose a draft Security Council resolution, which it knows will be vetoed by China, but simply to embarrass China and to focus a spotlight on the attention of those acts. And that, I think, focus on the human rights situation inside China, as well as, I think, the human rights situation with respect to Hong Kong, will be a priority issue. And I know that there are suspicions in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and perhaps inside China, that the Biden administration will be softer on China with respect to those issues. But I think that fails to consider the power of the human rights supporters of Biden, as well as the many supporters of human rights action inside the Congress, who may force Biden's hand with respect to human rights issues, both with respect to Hong Kong and Chinese actions with respect to its Muslim minority. Areas of strategic competition are those that I think were highlighted just now with respect to the Indo-Pacific region, how military there, what we're talking about is competition between the Quad military exercises, there and the military exercises conducted by China and allies in the Shanghai Cooperation Council, for instance. And you'll also see attempts by China to recruit more allies, both economic security allies in the region and counter efforts by the United States. Another area of strategic competition that could end up in tension points will be with respect to critical new technologies, where the US can be expected to continue to block a variety of transactions in the United States, a variety of Chinese actors, including Huawei, through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the CFIUS, for instance. So those are areas of tension, not quite equivalent to military, but areas where you could expect continued tensions between the two states. And then there are the areas of where you see cooperation, strategic cooperation. So you can expect that the same nations that are going head to head with respect to the South China Sea, with respect to competition for the hearts and minds for infrastructure projects, that is the U.S. equivalents to the Belt and Road, where the U.S. will try to back infrastructure projects in the same countries, even as a way to compete with China's influence. But despite that, from Monday through Thursday, you could find Friday through Sunday efforts to negotiate a nuclear arms control agreement with China, to collaborate on the active denuclearization of North Korea, bilateral agreements on cyber warfare, cyber espionage, bilateral agreements that I've mentioned on the peaceful uses of space, and even conceivably protocols on limiting AI-controlled autonomous weapons systems. Further cooperations in groups like the G20 on global macroeconomic and financial stability to prevent future global crises and recessions. And of course, lots of cooperation, I hope, with respect to Biden's top priority on climate change, and not just through the Paris Agreement and mutual commitments by both sides to reduce to zero emissions by a date certain, but a reigniting of the Obama initiatives with China to have bilateral arrangements between the two countries, which after all, between them control some 40% of carbon emissions. And that would also include, I think, some efforts on global pandemic notification, as well as cooperation on vaccine distribution and development. So there are some pockets of areas where I think you will see more cooperation between the two states. And so what we're talking about then is a complex relationship where the Biden administration will continue to say we're open to talking, but we're also open to combating China. And here, the way Biden has defined the relationship is quite revealing. He has suggested that that rather than decoupling and rather than a descent to a trade war, what we're really talking about is a strategic competition with some folks in the administration who already been announced to be in the administration, having taken the view that they fear that China is intent on global domination. Now, if those folks take the lead with the administration, then you can expect a far harsher view of China that might be reflected in the Atlantic Council report. I hope it doesn't go there, but I just want to warn folks who are listening that those of us who are predicting these things can't predict a miscalculation on one side or the other with respect to this. Among those miscalculations, I think, if you want to focus on the Chinese side for a minute, is that it's quite possible that the Chinese are taking the worst examples of US behavior from the past. So if you see the reaction to the Philippines v. China arbitration, that was briefly mentioned just now, China walked away from the possibility of even discussing it at the jurisdictional stage of that arbitral body. That is reminiscent of the worst behavior of the United States during the Cold War, when it walked away from the Nicaragua case in the ICJ. So China took the lesson, say if the U.S., big power at the time, can get away from a court without even making an argument that there is no jurisdiction, then so can we. More recently, we see China drawing conclusions from the emphasis by the Trump administration on fake news and conspiracy theories and calling the virus the Chinese virus. And now we see occasional conspiracy theories being pushed by some in China, presumably with at least some government support as to the origins of COVID, as to the vaccines and their efficacy in the United States and so forth, and to the point where I think just today there was what I can't think of anything as a tit for tat. So given the controversies attached to the World Health Organization's team that has arrived in Wuhan, now there is a statement that the team should next be sent to the United States to see the origins of COVID in the United States. And of course, there's still that lingering conspiracy notions. And this is drawn from the Trump playbook that the COVID escaped from a US military lab. That kind of tit for tat retaliation, emulating the worst rhetoric, the worst conspiracy notions, and totally absurd conspiracy theories is the kind of thing that could erode what I think could be a productive new relationship. I will say that the China Daily, which is something I pick up on a daily basis, I think was at least anticipating for perhaps propaganda purposes, two things that I don't think are quite true. So not too many days ago, they had a headline, a way seen for a quick reset of U.S.-China ties. There will be a reset, but nobody should expect it to be the kind of reset that we saw in the headier days of the early Obama administration. With that, I'll just open up, I hope, for a fruitful conversation on many areas that we did not get to talk about.
Well, Jose, again, as Nilufer did, you've laid out so comprehensively the issues that are on the table and the challenges. There may indeed be further areas that one or the other of you has not brought up, but in that case, I suspect we won't get to them because we already are not going to get to any more than a small percentage of these issues. Like the Biden administration itself, we're going to have to set some priorities. And so in some cases, you've already had the last word. But I wanted to maybe start with a few questions for Nilufer about the picture she drew of what ASEAN's priority list would be, I guess, for the Biden administration. From your introductory remarks, the words that came to my mind listening to you were benign neglect. You know, U.S. benign neglect of ASEAN as a partner in the region. And here, not just the Trump administration, but I know this goes back earlier. ASEAN often getting overlooked because of the big shadows cast by the bigger players in the region, China, Japan, India, if we think Indo-Pacific. And it seemed that if I was trying to distill what ASEAN's priority list would be, to-do list would be for Biden based on your remarks, and I thought it seemed like there were three key things that the US should, first of all, show up, and that it should turn down the heat in the South China Sea, and it should join the TPP-11, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership that moved forward without US participation. But of those three, it seems that only the first one is something that Biden can and his team can do on their own, regardless of what others do, and maybe politically is the only realistic thing of those three to do in the near term. Is that enough? So how much can Biden achieve in terms of both goodwill, in terms of changing the atmosphere, and maybe even subtly changing the dynamic of some of these challenges just by showing up more.
Thank you, Catherine. I think you've really distilled some of those key components very well and outlined some of the points that I made in the overview of ASEAN. And again, putting it into context, ASEAN is an intergovernmental organization. Its purpose is really primarily actually to create an economic integration of this region to make it stronger in the international arena. And really it has done quite well in that sense. It's not so much it's not a regional defense organization. I think that's important to note as well. So, but what happened, I think, and you talk about benign neglect, I'm not sure it's benign neglect, but it seemed to me that clearly China, and of course China is really directly more in the neighborhood, has engaged quite a bit more with ASEAN in many different ways than perhaps the US did. But still the US is an important, it's a partner, right? Not ally, but partner for the ASEAN states. And again, I'm using the ASEAN region as the organization, but each of these states has their own different relationships as well with China and the United States. So they're not fungible in that sense. But what can the Biden administration do? And it seems so simple, something like showing up to a meeting. But the fact that during the Trump period, he did not, and again, the incident of selling a low-level representative to Thailand during that summit was taken quite bad. And we have to remember Asian culture as well. This is important. And I think that's where what we see, the very direct confrontational attitude that the US was showing, particularly with Pompeo and Mark Esper, and the Asian way is less confrontational. They are not litigious like US is, let's say, to make it very simple. So even something simple like that, showing up, paying respect, would be important. Turning down the heat, absolutely. I understand the US position, freedom of navigation, that's around the world. They have the freedom of navigation, that's critical. But this is Southeast Asia. And so for the United States to ramp up the heat as if it's a direct conflict, I think has to be reexamined. These are the states that live there, they deal with China. And I think what's important is that they be given, that the US engage with them as well. And I think that in fact, this is Kurt Campbell, another article he had before his appointment. Really, it was more that the Biden administration should be perhaps building relationships and partnerships with the region. And that would help de-escalate. Instead of Pompeo going in and saying, you need to stand up to China. I don't think that's what they want to hear. And I think that's what we mean by, I think, turning down the heat and engaging and treating them, again, as equal sovereign states. And so that would be very important in the engagement. On the TPP, that's something I think I will let Jose perhaps talk about that part. But I think there's a great opportunity for the Biden administration. Instead of taking a very confrontational approach within the South China Sea region, to really engage with ASEAN, and through ASEAN, have this matter address, but not to go over ASEAN's head. That would be my sense. So I should just stop there.
Yeah, let me push you on that a little bit, because and I'm going to bring up the dreaded C word, culture, which we don't usually like to talk about in this context. But when you were talking about how the US engages mattering, and when you laid out ASEAN's principles, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, for example, some of that language sounded very familiar to anyone who pays attention to the way China talks about international relations. And so I do wonder if there's something on the cultural level that matters, that gives China a bit of an edge in of course, proximity also matters. So geography, just being right there in the neighborhood rather than, across the globe. But is there a cultural element there that gives China an edge that needs to be elevated? Because Biden is frequently spoken of as somebody who's focused on Europe. And so I'm wondering, what would his team get wrong if he tries to deal with ASEAN the way that they deal with, say, the EU or European bodies?
Yeah, that's again a very good question. And culture is important. And again, that's why I raised the issue of the ASEAN way. It is non-confrontational, mutual respect, non-interference. And I think that that is important. For Asia is not Europe. It's very clear. And I don't think they should be, the approach should not be the same. And so the question about China having an advantage, well, there's no doubt that Asian cultures will understand each other better. And you lived, I know, Catherine, for many years in that region. And so there may be nuances that someone from the United States or Europe will not pick up on. Language used. I mean, the fact of, not sending someone who's low level, and I mean, all these things. So culture is important. And I think at least I don't know if it's an advantage, but I think in terms of how ASEAN deals with China, it's in the ASEAN way. But if the US tries to impose its own way on ASEAN to deal with China, then that may be a source of tension and conflict itself, creating within ASEAN. So I would say that these are important issues that should be taken into account by the Biden. I think any US administration, and over the years, they should know that, actually, dealing with different countries, because you said winning the hearts and minds. The US has lost quite a few hearts and minds, actually. I come from Turkey. Turkey is an ally, but I know that over the years, it's remarkable that there's a great mistrust, actually. And so, but I think the risk for China is that they can fall into that same situation. The hearts and minds can be lost, but culture is important. So I'll just stop there.
Okay. So Jose, I wondered, amongst the many, you laid out so many critical issues with respect to China for Biden to focus on. Do you think that it is important for the administration to early on take the first move to engage in some way with China, to sort of take command, if you will, of the relationship, or try to say, this is the direction we want to steer it in? Or I've heard some suggesting that he might be better served by letting the Chinese make the first move, seeing whether they're willing to offer any kind of concessions on any of these many different areas, make a gesture, extend an olive branch, so to speak. If Biden were to try to move first, I also wonder whether one way to do it would be through any of the international organizations, the UN, or at any of these other bodies, as a way of making a move that helps to set a tone, but doesn't expose him too much, expose the US or Biden too much as, making any kind of concession.
Yeah, so I think that's a tricky question, but keep in mind that the US and China are already engaged because they are part of the P5 in the Security Council. So whether they like it or not, they are sending signals every day of the week with respect to how they behave behind closed doors. So you can expect behind closed doors the new UN ambassador from the Biden administration, who is an experienced diplomat, to set the tone And I think you can expect that one of the tones would be consistency, that at least now you will hear the same message throughout the administration. That is, you won't get inconsistent talk from our intelligence agencies versus the White House. I would expect that at least that much, a consistent tone as to which of these issues are red lines, for instance, and what we think the facts bear out as to who did the solar winds, and it wasn't you, China, it was Russia, right? That kind of messaging is quite important. As to who goes first, I think it will depend on the issue. I can see that the Biden administration's priorities are, of course, COVID, and climate change and economic protecting the economic development, workers, and so forth in the United States. A lot of that does go through China. And the messaging can be, we can work with China on climate change, not just to protect the earth, but also to send the message that green jobs can still stay here, even though we're cooperating with China with respect to their capacity to build very quickly electric batteries for cars and solar panels. Even though we may have the technological superiority, they do produce this stuff quickly. But the challenge is to convincing then the progressive part of the Democratic Party that that won't be exporting jobs, right? So he has to message this properly. But yes, I expect full engagement with China because I don't see a way to achieve the Paris Agreement or better without side agreements between the US and China. The same with respect to the other big problem, pandemics. I expect the US and China to work to some extent together in the WHO on some improvements. And we had a little exchange on this in our essay series, as you know. And I do think that there are pockets of WHO reform where the two sides are likely to agree. That may include a more disciplined approach to the declaration of public health emergencies, a more consistent messaging of what it means for the WHO to say through its IHRs, thou shalt not have travel bans. I mean, we have to have some acceptance of what that means. Where I do think there's going to be differences, and perhaps sharp ones, are with respect to the insistence, which I think the administration is right to continue to insist on, of a full, transparent report on what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, for lessons to be learned as to respect for frontline workers, warnings, transparency, accurate information to be delivered in real time quickly, so that the pandemic does not spread. And I don't think it would help China in the long run to try to prevent that honest assessment, even if it ends up blaming China at the beginning, at least. And China could rightly say, but thereafter, boy, did we do a better job than you did, US. That's the way to deal with that battle. I also think there's going to be battles on multilateralism and what it means. And I know, I think it means somewhat different things in different organizations with respect to US and China. Multilateralism with Chinese characteristics does not describe how the US and Europe sees the use of many of these institutions. So for example, I think you can expect tensions on whether Taiwan should be accepted as an observer in organizations like the WHO or the World Meteorological Organization. The US position is likely to be, this is about making these organizations effective. And if it means having credible Taiwanese observers so that it's effective within Taiwan and to get the benefits of those observers in the WHO, then politics should be put aside and allow Taiwan to be a participating observer as it has been in the past. And so that's an area of tension, as would be if the US were to, with other countries, to say that we need to strengthen the WHO notice and monitoring devices so that the IHRs become more fully legally binding and that there is some sort of reporting obligation that is met with some real sanctions if states don't cooperate on establishing the core medical capacities, on sending the information on time. I think there'll be real resistance to that because I do think that one of the characteristics of multilateralism with Chinese characteristics is soft law, soft cooperation. The Asian way is very much close to how China argues it should be done with respect to human rights, with respect to the UN Security Council, and of course, the WHO. So I do think there are going to be areas of tension, but yes, I think that it is quite possible for the Biden administration to initiate, especially on climate change and pandemic relief, and some areas of cooperation in the UN Security Council.
So one thing that strikes me when you talk about the US engaging with China in these different UN bodies and other multilateral bodies, you are framing it in terms of the US at these bodies can promote US goals. And China is part of that.
That can be consistent with Chinese goals. I think that China can be persuaded, if it isn't already, that the lack of control of the pandemic in the US matters to China and vice versa. That is, everybody has an interest in making a pandemic prevention a global goal, as everybody has an interest in making sure we mitigate climate change.
Right. The distinction I want to draw, though, is between the US going to these bodies to try to promote its interests, and in the course of that, engaging productively, hopefully, but at any rate, engaging with China as it would with other powers, versus what I think has been described as a mode of action in the past of the US going to these bodies, or let me rephrase that, the US trying to work with China on some of these issues as a way of improving the US-China mood music or the US-China relationship. So I think that is a subtle but important distinction that we may see, whereas in the past there may have been some habitual sense of, well, if we work together, if we cooperate together in other countries on health. So for example, the US and China for years cooperated in Africa to develop the African CDC, Centers for Disease Control. So here we have an opportunity to use Africa as our sandbox, as it were, for improving our bilateral relationship, rather than the way I heard you articulating, and I think I do see in some of the writings of members of the now Biden administration of, well, we're going to have our eyes on our goals, and yes, that means we have to work with China because China's there, which I would say is a really significant difference in, it's a shift in the thinking about it. I'm looking at the time already, amazingly. We have less than half an hour left, and so I'm thinking for the rest of the discussion, we may want to stay focused on the two really important issues that have been raised, which is trade and the South China Sea. But just quickly before we do that, a number of people in the chat panel, in the Q&A panel, have asked about Myanmar. And so just very, very briefly, I wanted to ask whether either of you thought that the coup in Myanmar, which of course the US has condemned, China not so strongly in typical mode, does this in any way become the sort of unexpected event that changes things, that forces the two parties to engage in any way, or might have any larger ramifications, or is this just an isolated event that the two sides will respond to in the usual fashion and it doesn't really change the dynamic at all?
Well, one thing that I think people should take from the Myanmar situation is that once the Biden administration said it was a military coup, which I think, given the facts, it was hard for it not to do, then certain laws kick in. And that is a backdrop in the US to suggest that the Biden administration is not the only actor in foreign affairs in the United States. It is constrained by US laws. And once you declare the coup, it is quite predictable that certain types of sanctions will emerge against Myanmar, independent of whether Congress then decides to do something else. And that takes off. And off we go into not just US sanctions taking place through the routine operation of government, but also the potential consequences of challenges in US court, as we now see with respect to certain sanctions imposed on Chinese enterprises during the Trump administration that proceed through court. So with the United States, even though we like to talk about foreign affairs as the executive branch, it is a three-ring circus. And we have to keep that in mind. And that includes Miramar. Now, with respect to Miramar, I think this falls more to my colleague, Professor Oral, because what I see now is this is not a winning strategy. That is, Miramar's coup has a lot of, let's just say, silent or vocal supporters within certain governments in ASEAN, who are not all models of democracy themselves. And that includes Thailand, for instance. And it is striking to me that among the most recent reactions, it's only been Japan that I see as taking the more strong stance consistent with the US. So whether it has a long-term issue or not depends in some part about what's going to happen inside Miramar. But it certainly has let's just say, does not strengthen the hand of the US inside ASEAN, what it's doing to one of its members, because I think some of them may see the handwriting on the wall with respect to first Miramar, then me.
I guess I jump in here then.
No, please.
Threw the ball into the ASEAN court. Well, just to say, Catherine, in response to your question yesterday, I guess, there was an emergency meeting held at the UN Security Council on Myanmar, and China blocked any decision coming out of that. And from the beginning, China's position has been that the international response should not create additional pressures. Taking, I guess, I think that's not to be surprised, because China has close relations with Myanmar. And again, as I talked about, the ASEAN states, ASEAN as a group wants an equidistance, but clearly individual states may have their own different relationships with China and the United States. But ASEAN as an organization, again, this is where their principles come in, non-interference. And so, and I think coming to what Professor Alvarez was saying, if I do this, next me. So ASEAN, individual states have expressed their concern, like Singapore, but I doubt very seriously that ASEAN itself will take some type of united position or speak openly against it, because that would be deemed an interference with domestic relations. So if, again, it goes to the point of where if there's pressure placed on ASEAN to use ASEAN as a way to get to Myanmar, that would cause problems. And this really comes down to, I think we talk about institutions, this is where the UN should be coming in as well. But again, we won't get into the whole Security Council that you get one blockage and there we go. But what I was reading is interesting, that actually that over the years, the Chinese government had developed good relations with the National League for Democracy, the party that was been ousted, and that perhaps they were not the relationship with the military may not be as comfortable. So that was interesting. I'm not an expert. I'm not a Myanmar Chinese expert, but I thought that was an interesting situation that we should be observing. But one other thing, and I won't mention which country, but I spoke about the ASEAN Charter, and someone who knows very well the drafting of the charter stated that apparently one of the ASEAN states very much wanted to have a provision in the charter that would prohibit military coups, and also allow for the expulsion of members. But again, because it operates by consensus, and during that time, that was rejected by some of the states. And it's for obvious reasons, obviously, but trying to looking at it using different language, such as that they're promoting that action should be taken that are constitutional. So if you look at the ASEAN Charter, it's somewhere in there that you shouldn't have a military coup. On the other hand, though, there isn't, I understand, a provision that would impose, expulsion from ASEAN. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to be observing as well, and that's all I think I can comment at this point.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to jump right into trade quickly. So as I said, two things I think we can discuss in our remaining time. ASEAN would support, you said, the U.S. joining the TPP-11. We understand that some other countries in the region that are already members, leading members like Japan, would also support it. But it would take a lot of political capital for Biden to try to join, and it doesn't seem very likely. Well, there's a very good chance he wouldn't succeed, and it doesn't seem likely that it'll be the first thing on his to-do list because he's got other things he needs to get through Congress. But short of rejoining that effort, are there other ways in which ASEAN and the U.S. could cooperate on trade that might perhaps help strengthen the U.S. in its position vis-a-vis China? So one question in the chat panel that prompts me to ask this points out that when some of the U.S. companies that manufacture in China are actually moving their export manufacturing out of China to Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, but also there's been movement to Indonesia and Cambodia and others. So short of the U.S. joining the TPP-11, is there anything that the U.S. could do with ASEAN to diversify trade, American manufacturing, to reduce the U.S. dependency on China as a supply chain hub, to strengthen ties between the U.S. and ASEAN? And I throw that out to both of you in whichever order you choose.
Well, since you mentioned ASEAN, I immediately assumed it was to Professor Earl.
Right.
Well, so I know that the individual states, they can have bilateral trade agreements. I know that, for example, Singapore has many bilateral trade agreements, and I'm sure there must be with the United States. Of course, it can continue investing, investing in ASEAN trade with ASEAN. And I guess even the TPP 11 plus 11, in terms of what I've been, how much it's really benefiting certain countries versus others, is also something that's debated. I think the concern would be, and this is from the ASEAN perspective, that it should not appear as if that the U.S. was engaging to dilute China's trade relationships with ASEAN. So that would be I think the delicate balance to ensure that not using ASEAN as a way to get at China, basically. And I think that's I would think that would be important. But sure, there would be plenty of opportunities. I mean, already they have growing trade relationships. But I think from the perspective of ASEAN, it's a regional agreement that they're engaged in, and to have the U.S. back in it as a sign of being part of the region. But I understand the difficulties that go. There's also the RCEP as well, which China has signed. So again, the U.S. has its own problems in that. But I'm sure the ASEAN states all welcome increasing, trade with all parties, including the U.S. But one thing I did read was that with the trade war imposing tariffs on China, and one of the things I guess that tariffs imposed was Christmas Christmas decorations, which apparently all of the U.S. Christmas decorations were imported from China. What did China do? They sent it to Cambodia, so ASEAN will benefit at some level, I have to say. And I thought that is an example where, how much can you really control, that type of, trying to block China trade and in the region. But now trade expert is Professor Alvarez. So
Catherine, I won't talk so much about the ASEAN connection, but I do think the TPP is worth saying a few things about. So among the many proposals that are now out there generated by academic bodies and others is one that I don't know if it's politically viable, but certainly something that the U.S. could do, which is a fairly high-level commission on the potential benefits, for example, of TPP for the United States to educate the American public, as well as some of the members of Biden's own party who totally resist any and all trade agreements based on some misunderstandings of what economically they do. And I do think that it is possible to move the needle at least a little bit, in part through a steady campaign. What I predicted in my big speech on this was that that Biden would seek renewal of fast track authority, trade promotion authority, which expires in the middle of this coming year, in order to have the credibility of conducting anything from bilateral treaties, as Professor Oral just mentioned, but also re-entry or entry into the TPP or other agreements. He needs to have that credibility, because without fast track authority, whereby Congress agrees in advance as to the trade goals, agrees in advance to pass implementing legislation, and agrees to do so in, say, 90 days, up and down vote without amendments, it is impossible to conclude a complex trade agreement. So I would expect that to be the first battle. If he manages to win that battle, that suggests already there are enough Democrats and Republicans that would think favorably on a possibility of a trade agreement if it had the right content. And then the struggle will be, well, what would be in the TPP that isn't there now that would convince, say, progressive Democrats? Among the changes I would expect would be insistence on climate mitigation provisions, because now that will be an insistence on all future U.S. trade agreements. I think that's something the Democrats would insist on. It certainly reflects what's suggested in the Democratic Party platform, and that Biden also seemed to agree to. I would also expect borrowing environmental provisions from, say, the EU-Canada CETA text, that kind of progressive provisions that would guarantee nobody should lower their environmental standards, and that free trade agreements should not be used as a tool for that. And in fact, it should be a tool to increase environmental standards. The tricky part is, apart from agreeing on what the new things would be, is how to achieve that inside an agreement where 11 parties have already agreed. Now, part of it, the thing that makes it slightly easier is that my understanding is that a few of them have not yet ratified, so that there is still the possibility of 4 or 5 that have not gone through the ratification procedures. So it is possible, certainly Japan, at least some people in Japan think it might be possible to convince the 11 that it's worth it to get a major economic power like the US to reopen their negotiations. But that is going to be a big push. The other question is, could the US achieve some of its goals through side agreements and the reservations? If you look at the TPP, it's a very complex agreement that permits the equivalent of multiple mini treaties within the treaty, as between different parts of the 11, striking different deals as between them through side letters and reservations. And extraordinary. I haven't seen quite as many and quite as detailed as provisions. So it's possible. But what I do have faith is that somebody like Catherine Tai, the new U.S. trade rep, seems to be the kind of astute negotiator among both the Democrats and the Republicans. She steered through the USMCA through a very skeptical bunch of members of Congress on both sides. So she has, and that, by the way, is the biggest battle. Not so much convincing the other states of the TPP, it's just convincing the U.S. Congress that it wants to do that. And remember that one of the 8 foreign policy trends that I stressed that will continue is the fact that any treaty, getting any treaty through Congress, whether it's the Senate or the House and the Senate together, and remember, different treaties have either a 2/3 vote or a majority vote, given the very thin democratic control of this Congress and the structural dimensions of the U.S. Constitution that make securing treaties, even in the best of circumstances, impossible. One senator in the Foreign Relations Committee can stop it in its tracks, which is why something like the UNCLOS is not ratified, even though everybody agrees that it's in the national security interests of the United States. If we can't even agree to the conventional law of the sea, all the rules, or most of the rules that we say are already customary international law. Most benefit enormously great maritime powers. It's all in the national security interests of the United States to affirm it. We can't get that through. We couldn't get it through in 2004 when basically every living president, and I can just list you, everybody from the Petroleum Institute to the Environmental Council endorsed this treaty. We couldn't get it through then. I'm not sure you're going to get it through now or even in the next 3 years. So that's a real problem. It goes beyond the TPP, but with trade agreements in particular, this is a really huge mountain to climb for a Democratic president.
Well, I'm glad you brought up UNCLOS because that allows us to segue slightly gracefully to the South China Sea. And I wanted to ask both of you what significance you would place on the phenomenon we've seen in the last less than 6 months, I think, where a number of countries, including several ASEAN countries, the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, but also Japan, the US, UK, Germany, and France have been sending notes verbale. I'm mispronouncing this, I know, but notes verbale to the United Nations objecting to China's claims over the South China Sea, the island chains that we're calling the Spratlys and the Paracels. How should we understand this action? What is its significance? And what can we expect to follow? I think some people have interpreted this as a sign that some of these countries, particularly some of the ASEAN ones that are actually claimants to portions of the Spratlys and Paracels, that they might be preparing to take further action directly against China, take China, as Philippines did, take China to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, or take it to the ICJ or something like that. This is a question for both of you.
So I can start. Keep in mind, there's a political and a legal dimension. If you face certain situations on the ground that you fail to object to, that could be deemed to be acquiescence, and you could be stopped from making that claim. So if, for example, China is doing something on an island that you think doesn't belong to it, or reclaiming turning a rock into an island in violation of UNCLOS, you file a note verbal to express your protest, which is a legal document that expresses you don't agree. So that if this issue were to come up in any forum, national court, UNCLOS itself, or an arbitration body, no one could say you sat on your rights when this happened. So a note verbal is a legal position that preserves your legal rights. And it is very significant when it comes to maritime disputes, territorial disputes, where sitting on your rights could end up changing the law over time, where occupied territory suddenly becomes, oh, somebody else's because you didn't object. Politically, of course, it could signal all sorts of things that, yes, we're now going to object and sending a signal to China. It could signal that, yes, maybe we're inclined to litigate this at some point or arbitrate it. But I would stress that the legal side of things shouldn't be ignored. A responsible lawyer is going to tell all of those governments, do something to formally object to something that you think violates your legal rights.
Nilufer, you're the law of the sea expert. What do you anticipate will be the follow-up, if anything, to the provision to these governments submitting notes for Bali?
Oh, well, first, of course, I agree with everything that Professor Alvarez has said. In this case, so first of all, most important, and I think that's always the at least the language that's being used, that and even it should be in the famous draft code of conduct that will eventually perhaps be finalized. But the Law of the Sea Convention, the principles of international law, peaceful resolution of disputes, and of course, for those who are parties to the Law of the Sea Convention, is to comply with the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention. So the South China Sea area is a disputed area. There are claimants, but also there are shipping interests. And I think that's what's coming out. If you go with the judgment of the arbitral tribunal, which basically decided there were no islands in the Spratlys, at least. They didn't talk about the Paracels, the Spratlys. So there's a area there that would be high seas. So if you're shipping, military, commercial, you want to preserve your rights of navigation. So through the note verbal, as Professor Alvarez is saying, preserving those rights. Now, it is an option in terms of, I would say, more for the claimant states. I know there was, I guess last year, Malaysia also filed an extended continental shelf claim, and that provoked a reaction from China as well. It could be, I've heard as well, at least one, ASEAN state perhaps could be considering going to the tribunal. But I would say this, it would be much better to do that than having a hot conflict, and I think that's what we talked about, multilateralism, institutionalism, the international system. It's really what it's all about. And it's just a pity. I think that I can say one thing, remarking on the comment that Professor Alvarez made about China, kind of following the footsteps of the United States and not appearing. For China, perhaps that was a strategic mistake as well. They could have at least gone to the jurisdictional aspects and perhaps made their case there instead of now doing it through different means and putting forth these arguments they have. And so preserving the rules-based system, the Law of the Sea Convention is supposed to reflect that if you're a party. So it could happen. But I think that, again, it's preserving rights. The South China Sea is such a strategic area. It's so important. So the international community does have an interest in it. But ultimately, I'll go back to the ASEAN. It is an ASEAN region. And I think that priority should be given to the ASEAN states to resolve these issues directly. So I'll stop there.
And to their interests. So we don't have time for more, unfortunately, but I think one takeaway from me is to try to highlight the ASEAN countries' agency and their importance as actors and potentially partners in their own right, but they should not be seen as pawns that the United States should be trying to move about on the chessboard, and the United States might actually serve its own interests well to see them as partners with their own interests and to work with them rather than attempt to use them as pawns via China. So this has been a great discussion, and I wish we had more time. Thank you both so much for it, and thank you to the audience for supplying such great questions today. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kath.